Paper 187. The Crucifixion. After the two brigands had been made ready, the soldiers, under the direction of a centurion, started for the scene of the crucifixion. The centurion in charge of these 12 soldiers was the same captain who had led forth the Roman soldiers the previous night to arrest Jesus in Gethsemane. It was the Roman custom to assign 4 soldiers for each person to be crucified. The 2 brigands were properly scourged before they were taken out to be crucified, but Jesus was given no further physical punishment. The captain undoubtedly thought he had already been sufficiently scourged, even before his condemnation. The 2 thieves crucified with Jesus were associates of Barabbas, and would later have been put to death with their leader if he had not been released as the Passover pardon of Pilate. Jesus was thus crucified in the place of Barabbas. What Jesus is now about to do, submit to death on the cross, he does of his own free will. In foretelling this experience, he said, "The Father loves and sustains me because I am willing to lay down my life. But I will take it up again. No one takes my life away from me. I lay it down of myself. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up. I have received such a commandment from my Father." It was just before 9 o'clock this morning when the soldiers led Jesus from the praetorium on the way to Golgotha. They were followed by many who secretly sympathized with Jesus, but most of this group of 200 or more were either his enemies or curious idlers who merely desired to enjoy the shock of witnessing the crucifixions. Only a few of the Jewish leaders went out to see Jesus die on the cross. Knowing that he had been turned over to the Roman soldiers by Pilate, and that he was condemned to die, they busied themselves with their meeting in the temple, whereat they discussed what should be done with his followers. 1. On the way to Golgotha. Before leaving the courtyard of the praetorium, the soldiers placed the crossbeam on Jesus' shoulders. It was the custom to compel the condemned man to carry the crossbeam to the site of the crucifixion. Such a condemned man did not carry the whole cross, only this shorter timber. The longer and upright pieces of timber for the 3 crosses had already been transported to Golgotha and, by the time of the arrival of the soldiers and their prisoners, had been firmly implanted in the ground. According to custom, the captain led the procession, carrying small white boards on which had been written with charcoal the names of the criminals and the nature of the crimes for which they had been condemned. For the 2 thieves, the centurion had notices which gave their names, underneath which was written the one word, brigand. It was the custom, after the victim had been nailed to the crossbeam and hoisted to his place on the upright timber, to nail this notice to the top of the cross, just above the head of the criminal, that all witnesses might know for what crime the condemned man was being crucified. The legend which the centurion carried to put on the cross of Jesus had been written by Pilate himself in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, and it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Some of the Jewish authorities who were yet present when Pilate wrote this legend made vigorous protest against calling Jesus the King of the Jews. But Pilate reminded them that such an accusation was part of the charge which led to his condemnation. When the Jews saw they could not prevail upon Pilate to change his mind, they pleaded that at least it be modified to read, "He said, I am the King of the Jews." But Pilate was adamant. He would not alter the writing. To all further supplication he only replied, "What I have written, I have written." Ordinarily, it was the custom to journey to Golgotha by the longest road, in order that a large number of persons might view the condemned criminal. But on this day they went by the most direct route to the Damascus Gate, which led out of the city to the north, and following this road, they soon arrived at Golgotha, the official crucifixion site of Jerusalem. Beyond Golgotha were the villas of the wealthy, and on the other side of the road were the tombs of many well-to-do Jews. Crucifixion was not a Jewish mode of punishment. Both the Greeks and the Romans learned this method of execution from the Phoenicians. Even Herod, with all his cruelty, did not resort to crucifixion. The Romans never crucified a Roman citizen. Only slaves and subject peoples were subjected to this dishonorable mode of death. During the siege of Jerusalem, just 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, all of Golgotha was covered by thousands upon thousands of crosses upon which, from day to day, there perished the flower of the Jewish race. A terrible harvest indeed of the seed-sowing of this day. As the death procession passed along the narrow streets of Jerusalem, many of the tender-hearted Jewish women who had heard Jesus' words of good cheer and compassion, and who knew of his life of loving ministry, could not refrain from weeping when they saw him being led forth to such an ignoble death. As he passed by, many of these women bewailed and lamented, and when some of them even dared to follow along by his side, the Master turned his head toward them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but rather weep for yourselves and for your children. My work is about done. Soon I go to my Father. But the times of terrible trouble for Jerusalem are just beginning. Behold, the days are coming in which you shall say, Blessed are the barren, and those whose breasts have never suckled their young. In those days will you pray the rocks of the hills to fall on you, in order that you may be delivered from the terrors of your troubles." These women of Jerusalem were indeed courageous to manifest sympathy for Jesus, for it was strictly against the law to show friendly feelings for one who was being led forth to crucifixion. It was permitted the rabble to jeer, mock, and ridicule the condemned, but it was not allowed that any sympathy should be expressed. Though Jesus appreciated the manifestation of sympathy in this dark hour when his friends were in hiding, he did not want these kind-hearted women to incur the displeasure of the authorities by daring to show compassion in his behalf. Even at such a time as this, Jesus thought little about himself, only of the terrible days of tragedy ahead for Jerusalem and the whole Jewish nation. As the Master trudged along on the way to the crucifixion, he was very weary. He was nearly exhausted. He had had neither food nor water since the Last Supper at the home of Elijah Mark. Neither had he been permitted to enjoy one moment of sleep. In addition, there had been one hearing right after another up to the hour of his condemnation, not to mention the abusive scourgings with their accompanying physical suffering and loss of blood. Superimposed upon all this was his extreme mental anguish, his acute spiritual tension, and a terrible feeling of human loneliness. Shortly after passing through the gate on the way out of the city, as Jesus staggered on bearing the crossbeam, his physical strength momentarily gave way, and he fell beneath the weight of his heavy burden. The soldiers shouted at him and kicked him, but he could not arise. When the captain saw this, knowing what Jesus had already endured, he commanded the soldiers to desist. Then he ordered a passer-by, one Simon from Cyrene, to take the crossbeam from Jesus' shoulders, and compelled him to carry it the rest of the way to Golgotha. This man Simon had come all the way from Cyrene in northern Africa to attend the Passover. He was stopping with other Cyrenians just outside the city walls, and was on his way to the temple services in the city when the Roman captain commanded him to carry Jesus' crossbeam. Simon lingered all through the hours of the Master's death on the cross, talking with many of his friends and with his enemies. After the resurrection and before leaving Jerusalem, he became a valiant believer in the gospel of the kingdom, and when he returned home, he led his family into the heavenly kingdom. His 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus, became very effective teachers of the new gospel in Africa. But Simon never knew that Jesus, whose burden he bore, and the Jewish tutor who once befriended his injured son were the same person. It was shortly after 9 o'clock when this procession of death arrived at Golgotha, and the Roman soldiers set themselves about the task of nailing the 2 brigands and the Son of Man to their respective crosses. 2. The Crucifixion. The soldiers first bound the Master's arms with cords to the crossbeam, and then they nailed his hands to the wood. When they had hoisted this crossbeam up on the post, and after they had nailed it securely to the upright timber of the cross, they bound and nailed his feet to the wood, using one long nail to penetrate both feet. The upright timber had a large peg inserted at the proper height, which served as a sort of saddle